France, January 1945. Snow tore sideways like sand in a storm. The bridge shuddered under distant impacts, tank treads grinding through the fog. I pressed my back to a cracked concrete pillar, launcher frozen in my hands, rifle slung behind me like a useless promise. Ahead of me, a German column crossed the river. Behind me, 6 wounded men lay under the mill stairs, their breath misting in the dark. The radio whispered one word through static. Retreat. I switched it off. And stayed. Because sometimes, the map lies. Remilly, Eastern France. January 1945. On paper I belonged to the 45th Infantry Division, a thin thread stitched across the Moselle like a seam holding a torn coat. The order had come days earlier in blue pencil: hold until engineers arrive, then fall back. It sounded tidy at a table. Out here the table had been blown apart. The river ran black under ice. The bridge was a concrete truss with spalled faces and frost thrusting from its cracks like glass. I knew its spans by touch: 4 steps from the pillar to the seam, 8 to the parapet, 2 to the charge well. I had checked them in the dark. We were supposed to be a relay in a larger machine: scouts to warn, sappers to wire, infantry to cover, artillery to reach out and correct the world. Instead, the machine had stripped its gears. Fuel convoys never arrived. The last tanker we saw burned for 6 hours on the East Road. Telephone lines were cut in a tangle of poplars. The SCR 536 on my hip whispered vowels and then snow. Our 105s answered once, then fell silent. After that, everything was closer than it should have been. The lieutenant died at first light 2 days ago when a 10.5 shell walked across the abutment and found him standing with a map. I took the map because the wind would have taken it otherwise. His pencil line, southern embankment, phase line green, looked decisive. The line did not know the wounded under the mill stairs, nor the civilians pinned in the houses behind the road bend, nor the narrow geometry that made a retreat an execution. I had a 2.36-inch M1A1 launcher, thawed over a charcoal stub until the paint blistered. The spare rockets rode in a bread bag with the fins wrapped in rag. My rifle was an M1 with a pitted gas cylinder that still cycled if I kept the grease thin. 2 grenades, 1 red smoke for marking, 3 bandages. In the cold, everything gained weight and lost faith. The written instruction was simple: hold for the engineers, then yield the span. The engineers did not come. Their sergeant had spoken to me the previous evening, voice flat through the handset: we're diverted north. Keep the site cold. Blow only on command. I said the detonators were sluggish. He said to wait. I waited until the wires ate ice and turned the color of the river. Artillery found us from both flanks, as if 2 fists were closing around a throat. The left bank took 81mm mortars, quick, moderate, disciplined, while the right bank caught heavier work that shook the bridge dust down in sheets. The smoke smelled of sugar beets from the mill and of cordite from yesterday's defense. In that mix I could still taste the powder from my own last sh*T. I kept inventory for no one. 2 boxes of .30-06, partial. 5 rockets after the test fire that proved the tube would still spit. 1 spool of dry wire I could not connect to anything living. 6 men behind me with wounds that had settled to a low fire: leg, shoulder, gut, scalp, shoulder again, and a man who had lost 2 fingers and the idea of sleep. I rotated socks on their feet, tucked blankets to keep their heat from flowing into the stone, counted pulses when the shelling paused. I told them the medics were nearby. It was a sentence I did not believe. The division numbers meant less than the soil under my knees. Units flowed like water through a cracked field. A British liaison half-track rattled past before dusk the night prior, a white star and a small red pennant fluttering on its antenna. The corporal inside asked if the bridge was wired. I said yes. He said then the road was safe. He drove into fog and did not come back the same way. We were told to fall back to the southern embankment if command lost the line. Command lost the line. The radio caught a final clean word, retreat, shaped by a voice I did not know. The word made sense within the map's neat edges. It did not match the ground's arithmetic. If I moved, the 6 behind me would not move. If I left, the bridge would be a gift wrapped in hoarfrost. If the crossing went, the road to the aid station became a straight throat to the south, not a route, but a sentence. I thought of the engineers' charges nested in ice, the frozen wax on their caps, the way brittle insulation cracks when you breathe on it wrong. I thought of the rifle pits I had scraped into cinder and snow, the arcs of fire traced with a spoon in the dirt, the sight line to the third pier where an enemy would pause to decide which way to angle his armor across the crown. I thought of rules that were made for days when machines answered, gasoline flowed, and men could be moved like pins on felt. Behind us, the houses had faces, shutters wired shut against pressure, doors sandbagged hip-high, a prayer card nailed under a lintel. A girl had pressed a loaf on me 2 nights earlier, dense and black, wrapped in a scarf. I cut it into 7 and told the men to chew slow. The scarf lined my pocket and kept the radio from icing as quickly. I was not brave. I was busy. Busy is what you become when no one is coming. So I stayed under the bridge's ribs and did the math that the order could not do. A column on the far bank. A river under ice. A road that led not away but toward people who could not move. And a rule that had forgotten them. Before the war I fixed things that complained in plain language, tractors that coughed, pumps that lost their prime, belts that frayed and sang. Kansas plains to the horizon, dust in the teeth, winter air clean enough to ring. My father's workshop sat behind the house, a rectangle of corrugated tin with a wood stove that ticked like a patient metronome. The sign over the door said Lawson and Son, though the paint on and Son was newer and always a little crooked. I never straightened it. It told the truth. I learned torque with my hands before I learned the word. A 9/16 wrench will lie to you if your knuckles are numb. Grease carries grit, you wipe fittings before you wipe yourself. Bearings talk when they're failing, a small, tired whine that becomes a scrape just before heat climbs. I kept a notebook of part numbers and tricks, how to shim a governor with a sliver of Prince Albert tin, how to coax a stuck wrist pin with heat from a kerosene lamp and patience measured in breaths. My mother said I wasn't brave, only stubborn with broken things. She was right. If a machine quit, I could not walk past it. I saw failure as a map, lines leading back to a cause. Loose ground at the battery. Water in the fuel. A hidden crack marching along a weld like frost. Sundays, when weather let us, my father and I listened for storms on a radio he built from a kit. Wires strung like veins, an oak case rubbed with linseed. I loved the hiss before a voice found itself. Static meant distance and weather and 100 decisions you could not control. He taught me to rest a palm on the speaker to feel the low end, the way thunder prints through cloth. Money was thin. A field gives what it wants. We took what we could. Payment came as sacks of wheat, pie, a heifer promised at calving. I kept a coffee can of cotter pins sorted by size, a cigar box of odd bolts, a drawer full of washers punched from roofing tin. Waste was a word for men who had never broken a knuckle in January. I wrote my last letter home at a depot in Texas. I told them I wasn't the best soldier but I knew how to keep things running. I meant men as much as machines. If you keep breath moving, blood follows. My mother underlined a sentence in blue and sent it back with a pressed leaf between the pages. The leaf cracked on the train north. I was never a hunter for sport. I preferred the slow aim of a level, the certainty of a bubble-caught dead center. A fence must carry true for 50 yards or it will shame you at the last post. The land taught arithmetic. Slope, load, frost line. You set posts deeper than you think and pack the hole with gravel so water has a place to go. The first engine I rebuilt alone was a Farmel with a tired magneto and a cracked head. I brazed the crack with a rod I did not trust and learned that yellow metal can hold when you keep the flame soft. I turned the crank slow until compression told me I had not wasted the week. When it caught, the exhaust coughed a coal of soot onto the dirt and the sound rose to a steady square. I liked that square. It meant promise. I carried habits from the shop into everything. Lay parts out in the order you take them off. Chalk the floor with numbers. Mark top dead center not just in your head but with a file nick you can find when your lamp fails. Keep a rag in your pocket for heat, another for truth. The first takes grease. The second wipes your hands before you shake. Girl said I smelled like oil even when I washed twice. Maybe I did. The smell meant work and winter and bread and a lamp blown out with a careful breath. You can tell a lot about a man by the way he snuffs a flame, hurried, careless, tender to the last inch of wick. I watched wheat bend under wind like an army that understood orders. I watched it stand again. That's all courage is, I thought, to fall in a direction that lets you rise without tearing your roots. When the draft card came, I folded it along the printed lines and creased it with my thumbnail. I did not think about glory. I thought about cold starting and bad gasoline. I thought about metal that shrinks in frost and hands that refuse to close. I thought about radios and their delicate vowels lost in weather. Basic taught me to name the rifle and sleep with it as if ownership could change its mind about jamming. I cleaned the gas cylinder with strokes counted like prayer. The armorer said I was wasting time. He issued rifles, I kept them honest. We did not argue. The army wanted men who moved when told. I could move. But the habit of repair followed me like a dog. I fixed boots with wire and mess stoves with borrowed jets. I sharpened a can lid into a scraper and pulled carbon from a bolt face until it shined like a small moon. On train windows I watched poles pass at a rhythm that matched a four-stroke: intake, compression, power, exhaust. I counted them through states. Counting steadied the breath. Later, when shells began to make their own arithmetic, that rhythm would keep me from wasting the first second after impact. I was not built for speeches. I was built for the second nail when the first splits the board. I believe there is always a way to carry weight without breaking a back, if you think about balance before you lift. That was my faith. So when the war brought engines I had never seen, maps with teeth, and rules written by men who loved tables, I held to the one certainty I owned: everything, even fear, has a mechanism. If you find the sticking point and ease it, with heat, with patience, with a hand that trusts the threads, you can make it move again. That is all I was before the winter in France, a man who could not leave a broken thing. A son with oil under his nails, a notebook of small fixes, a careful ear for the sound a machine makes just before it lives. The night before the attack the air froze hard enough to split timber. You could hear it, a slow, internal crack that rolled through the rafters of the ruined mill. I slept in half minutes, waking each time the wind changed. The charges under the bridge were my responsibility, though no one had said it aloud. When the engineers left, they left the detonator box and a coil of line that looked older than I was. At 2 in the morning I took a lantern and crawled down to the pier. The wires lay half buried in rime. Each connection I scraped with my knife until the copper showed through. The battery case had swollen, paint lifting like old skin. I tested it with my thumb, the needle rose slow, then fell. In that cold, electricity moved like syrup. I replaced the cap, marked the time in my notebook, and breathed on the fuses until the glass clouded. My breath turned to ice on the casing. By regulation, I was supposed to report the fault. I did. The lieutenant, still alive then, rubbed his eyes and said, "Not your problem, Private. Just cover the retreat." He was right by the book. My rank didn't allow initiative. The bridge was a page in someone else's ledger. When the engineers came back, it would be theirs again. Until then, I was decoration with a rifle. When dawn touched the water it looked like poured lead. The sun came without heat, a pale disk over the fog. I checked the detonators once more, still frozen. Even if the battery revived, the primer caps would not take current through ice. I could have smashed them with a rifle but lit the charges by hand, but that was another page, another order. The others woke to shellfire to the east. It sounded far at first, then closer, a rhythm you could time with the pulse in your jaw. I moved among the wounded, tightened bandages, made sure the morphine syrettes were within reach. One man had started to cough pink foam. I turned his head so he wouldn't drown in it. He thanked me as if I had given him water. By mid-morning, the fog lifted enough to see the far tree line. Tracks scored the snow like black handwriting. I used the field glasses and saw movement, armor, infantry, half-tracks. Their line was organized, patient. They weren't probing, they were crossing. If they reached the bridge intact, they could roll through Remilly before noon. I keyed the radio again. Static. Then a voice, thin as wire, fall back to southern embankment. That was all. No confirmation, no acknowledgement of position. I said my call sign twice and asked about the engineers. The channel died. Regulation told me to obey. Distance told me I could not. Behind me, the mill crouched like a wounded animal, stone walls breathing steam. Inside, 6 men who could not stand. One kept asking about trucks. Another whispered for his brother. They were ghosts already, but ghosts are heavy when you know their names. I thought of abandoning the charges, running the span, crossing before the column arrived. I could claim the line was cut, the cold too severe. No one would question it. Orders were flexible when men disappeared in snow. But as I watched the first shapes emerge from the tree line, the angled plates, the exhaust plumes gray against white, I knew the bridge was no longer a structure. It was a fuse that reached all the way to the wounded behind me. I took stock. 1 functional launcher. 5 rockets, maybe 6 if the cracked one held together. The backblast would K*LL me if I fired too close, and the pier offered no cover. The rifle would not scratch armor, grenades even less. I could shoot infantry, by seconds, not minutes. I told myself seconds might be enough. I remember the sound most clearly, the low growl of engines filtered through mist, the metallic chime of track pins, the soft moan of ice under weight. The first tank, a Panther, by the silhouette, halted short of the bridge to test the surface. Its commander climbed half out of the turret, goggles fogged, scarf stiff with frost. He waved his hand, signaling others forward. They trusted the span. They always trusted concrete. I aimed once, then lowered the tube. Too far. The rocket would tumble before contact. I needed them closer, close enough to smell the exhaust. The rule in the manual said 50 yards minimum to survive your own blast. I measured 30 by eye and decided that would have to be enough. Behind me the wounded stirred, hearing the engines. One called out, "They coming?" I said, "Soon." I didn't tell him how soon. A shell landed upriver, distant but heavy, and the bridge quivered. The enemy artillery was softening crossings in sequence. We were next. I crouched lower, checked the firing pin on the launcher again. The spring resisted, stiff from frost, but it moved. Good enough. For the next hour I lived in increments of breath. When the wind carried diesel toward me I knew they were on the ramp. I could have pulled the trigger then and maybe broken the lead tank's track. I waited instead. Let them commit weight. Let the bridge hold enough of them to make the fall worthwhile. That was the problem and the temptation, to wait for perfection and die before it arrived. Every rule in the book taught patience, control, economy. But the book had never met ice that rewrites electricity. It had never crouched with 6 men bleeding behind a wall that would not stop a shell. So I broke patience the way a man breaks glass, suddenly, without elegance. I rose to one knee, pressed the sight to my cheek, and waited for the panther to fill it. The muzzle flash from their escort G*N cut through the fog. I exhaled, squeezed. The trigger stuck once, then gave. The rocket leapt into the mist trailing a comet's tail of fire. When it struck, the bridge seemed to exhale. The explosion rolled back through the arches, echo turning to thunder. I was already falling before I heard myself hit the snow. Above me, smoke bloomed black against white. The rules had ended. The war, for that moment, was mine to conduct. The blast threw me into the snow and heat seared the side of my face like a brand. For a second the world was only noise, an animal roar, the crack and ping of metal, men shouting without sense. My ears rang, a taste like copper filled my mouth. When I rolled over, the launcher lay a length away, fins bent, paint frosted with blood and soot. The panther's hull shuddered and a bloom of orange steamed from its turret seam. The commander's head snapped back, something in the engine room had gone wrong. He cursed in a language I recognized by tone, not by meaning. I stood because standing was less unsteady than thinking. The snow stuck to my boots, then to my trousers as the backblast had thrown a thin glaze of frozen grit across everything. I grabbed my rifle and began to shoot. Not at armor, a .30-06 against a panther is a confession, but at the infantry that spilled from its support half-tracks like a bad spring. They were disoriented, faces peeled pale by the blast, rifles held at angles. Their numbers thinned when I hit them, their formation folded. There was no plan. Plans are a paper thing. What I had was position, noise, and the stubbornness to keep one more second than the Germans expected. I moved between broken cover, a collapsed cart, the upright ribs of a half-track, the lee of an overturned cart filled with bags of mill grain that smelled faintly sweet under the gore. Each fired burst was an arithmetic: aim, exhale, press. Bullets carved edges from concrete. A tracer stitched a thin green line into fog and then fell short with a clink that sounded like small coins. Time telescoped. Minutes shredded into a list of actions. I cleared a jam on a jammed bar using my bayonet, and a man who'd been groaning turned his head and breathed a long, thankful breath. I dragged him a yard and lay over him so the wind wouldn't take his heat. I found a jammed .30 belt inside a half-track and fed it into a mounted G*N. The receiver spit life and teeth. I told the lad manning it to keep sweeping the parapet. He obeyed like a man who had been given a map to tomorrow. Sergeant Green arrived in a British Scout tank as if summoned by the sound itself. Its engine was a cough at first, then a full chrome growl. He was a small, hard-eyed man from a town that used its consonants as we *P*NS. He swung the little turret into place and nailed a short, savage burst down the road. We fell into a loose rhythm. He pushed iron while I picked teeth from around him. The bridge became our stubborn thing, an axle in a machine that had lost its other parts. We held together until the sky answered with copper and iron. A mortar round found the Scout, the hull folded and a ripple of flame ran through its belly. Green's voice went thin in the smoke and then deeper. I watched him slump and then stop. The tank burned like a funeral pyre, a small, absurd candle in the white day. Without thinking, I climbed the charred hull onto its rear deck. The .50 caliber that sat there was hot, a metal heart. I cranked it free of jam and put my shoulder to it. The G*N took command. It coughed, then sang in a guttural, constant tone. The recoil shoved me back, then forward again, and each burst unstitched another small piece of the German advance. They tried 3 times to storm the bridge in waves. Each time they formed ranks, each time we broke them on the parapet. Men fell in drifts. I could count their numbers by how the snow darkened. The world narrowed to the we *P*N's rhythm: feed, fire, clear, feed. Breath, movement, the clockwork of violence. There was a point where exhaustion and instinct braided. You no longer chose actions so much as performed them. I stopped thinking of rules. Rules were paper that could not warm a man or close a wound. The only law that mattered was the one under my hands: keep the crossing closed. For 3 hours the valley became a saw. Artillery overhead came in fits and then silence, as if some unseen hand tested our nerves and moved on. The German attempts grew desperate: flamethrowers, a sapper who tried to run along the bridge with a satchel charge and found a bullet in his forehead, but each assault met the same refusal. We were a stubborn callus on a wound. When our artillery finally came back, late as anything in war, the smoke changed its character. Shells from our side landed beyond the river with the measured and familiar thud, and a pattern emerged that pushed the attackers back. Radios clicked alive with voices that had been mute for too long. Reinforcements edged along the tree-line and, in the small way that signals a tide, pushed. After it stopped, silence was not peace but assessment. I sat in the lee of the bridge and watched men move like careful insects among wrecks, checking pulses and counting cartridges. My arm burned where shrapnel had nicked me, sweat and snow had dried into a hard crust on my sleeve. One of the wounded lifted his head and touched my shoulder with a glove that was too thin. "You stayed," he said. It was not a question. Later, when the engineers came with pry bars and thermite and carried their faces like the faces of men who deliver verdicts, their sergeant asked, "Who held this?" His voice wanted a unit name, a platoon, something bureaucratic to file. I looked up at him and answered with the small truth I had left. We did. Mostly by breaking the rules. When silence settled, it was thick enough to feel. Smoke hung under the arches of the bridge, trapped between cold air and water vapor. The river moved slow beneath, dragging pieces of burnt wood and darker shapes I didn't want to name. The engineers stood at the far end, counting blast marks, muttering over maps. One of them, a corporal with wire spectacles fogged white, kept shaking his head like the damage offended him personally. I stayed where I was, back against the parapet, boots half buried in frozen mud, watching snow fall through smoke. My sleeve was stiff with dried blood. I didn't know whose. The burn on my arm had blistered under the jacket. Each time I flexed my elbow, the fabric stuck and tore again. Pain felt clean, almost mathematical, an answer that balanced the equation. Around me the wounded stirred. The one who'd asked, "They coming?" earlier now slept with his mouth open. His pulse moved slow at the neck, steady. Against all logic, he was alive. When the first engineer reached me, he spoke the way a man does at a funeral, careful, formal, unsure who belongs to the dead. "Who held the bridge?" he asked. I told him, "We did. But I think I'm the only one left." He wrote something in a small notebook, nodded, and walked away. A moment later I heard him repeating my words to his lieutenant. They became lighter with distance, like stones skipped over water. They brought stretchers for the wounded. I helped lift them. The bodies were stiff, clothing frozen into boards. We stacked *P**NS in a neat pile under the mill wall. My launcher went on top. Its tube was warped, paint gone, handle cracked where the blast had thrown it. One of the engineers looked at it and said, "You fired that at this range?" I nodded. He whistled softly. "Lucky it didn't take your head off." I didn't answer. Luck had nothing to do with it. By dusk the bridge looked almost ordinary again, just another scar in the white landscape. The wrecked Panther smoldered on the far ramp, its track plates cooling to the color of dull pewter. Crows landed on the barrel, too tired or too hungry to fear heat. I counted 6 of them. When they lifted off, they left black shapes against the pale river, punctuation marks without a sentence. The engineers debated whether to blow the bridge or keep it. I listened but didn't join. One argued it should be demolished before another attack, the other said it might serve as a supply route once the line advanced. Both assumed the war still followed logic. I had seen enough to know it didn't. Orders were just reflections. By the time they reached the ground, everything had changed. A field medic wrapped my arm with clean gauze and told me to report to triage on the south bank. I said I would. I didn't move. The river's sound filled the silence where voices had been. I remembered Kansas rivers, brown, thick with silt, alive with summer insects. This one was different, cold, silent, efficient. It carried nothing that floated. Someone started collecting dog tags. The metallic clink came at steady intervals. I tried not to follow the rhythm, but every sound finds its pattern eventually. When they reached Sergeant Green's body, they found his hand still gripping the machine G*N's handle. The skin had fused to the metal. They had to pour canteen water to free it. The tag went in the same pouch as the others. No ceremony, just weight added to a ledger. The sun, when it appeared, was red through smoke. It hung above the horizon like a furnace door half shut. I thought of the forge in my father's workshop, how iron glowed before it failed, how color was both beauty and warning. I looked down at my hands, black lines of soot traced the cracks in my skin, and under them, tremor. The kind that doesn't stop when you notice it. A jeep arrived after dark with an officer I didn't know. He asked for a report. I gave it to him exactly, times, ranges, ammunition count, estimated enemy strength. When I finished, he said, Private Lawson disobeyed a direct order to withdraw. His action prevented enemy seizure of the crossing and saved 6 wounded men. He read it from a clipboard, as if the words had been written before I spoke. He asked me to sign at the bottom. I did. My handwriting shook. The ink froze halfway through my name, leaving the N faint. They wanted to send me to the rear. I refused twice, then relented when my legs refused to cooperate. The truck ride south was silent except for the engine's hum. Frost gathered inside the windshield, the driver scraped it with a knife every few minutes. On the seat beside me sat the spent shell casing from my first SH*T, a brass cylinder dented near the rim, polished where I'd handled it too long. I didn't remember pocketing it, but there it was, warm from my hand. At the field station they cut my sleeve and dabbed iodine until the world blurred. The doctor asked how long I'd been out there. I said, since it started. He smiled without humor. It's still starting, he said. He told me to rest. I didn't. I lay awake listening to the generators outside, the constant whine of fuel being burned just to keep lights alive. It reminded me of home again, of the steady drone of the water pump that never failed as long as someone cared to oil it. They kept me 3 days. Each morning a clerk came by with forms. Each evening I heard rumors, reinforcements crossing at Remilly, the enemy pushed back across the river, the bridge now part of the new line. None mentioned the men who had held it first. History doesn't need names when coordinates will do. When they finally released me, I walked back to the river before leaving. The bridge stood black against new snow. Engineers had replaced the damaged span with timber planks, rough but serviceable. On the parapet, soot traced the outline of a hand, mine, maybe, pressed there when the world was louder. I left it untouched. Let the wind decide when to erase it. That night, for the first time, I slept without dreaming of engines or maps. Just the sound of water moving under ice, steady, patient, endless, as if the river itself had taken the story and promised to carry it somewhere quieter. After the war I went home to Kansas and did the one thing that still made sense. I opened a small garage with my father. Lawson and Son became Lawson Service, because the old sign had rotted at the edges and the "and Son" fell off in a windstorm. I kept the crooked board anyway and nailed it inside above the workbench. The stove ticked in winter the same way it had before the draft card, and the smell of hot oil returned like a language I hadn't spoken in years but hadn't forgotten. Men drifted in who had been places the map never printed: Hurtgen, Anzio, Colmar, St. Lo. Some came with cars that rattled, most came with hands that shook. I hired 3 of them. We said little. We kept the radios low. When a backfire cracked on Main Street, we kept our eyes down and measured breath until the quiet returned. I learned which customers needed their spark advance adjusted and which needed a chair, a mug, and a task small enough to steady fingers. Work is a kind of medicine when it asks just the right amount of you. On the shelf by the register stood a single spent shell casing, polished until the brass caught the light. You could see your face in it if you wanted, and you could look away if you didn't. I had engraved the rim with a letter punch, 1 blow per stroke, Remilly 1945. People asked why I kept it. I told them it was a reminder to check the fuse first and the map second. Most nodded as if that were a joke and left satisfied. The ones who understood didn't ask again. Now and then the mail brought something stiff with government ink, a form to sign, a citation misaddressed, a request for details for a history man who was building a book that would sit on a shelf and pretend to be memory. I answered what I could without names. Names belong to families, not to print. I married a woman whose father had once brought me a tractor carburetor in a shoebox. She had kind eyes and a way of listening that felt like shade in August. We raised 2 boys who learned early that a seized nut gives way to patience and heat, and that anger is a poor wrench. One went to college for engineering. The other stayed and learned to listen to misfire by ear. Every few years I got a letter from a man who had been there on the riverbank, a medic now in Nebraska, a teacher in Ohio, a farmer in Wisconsin. The letters were mostly weather and birthdays. Between the lines ran the same quiet gratitude that is too heavy for speech. I replied in the same language. We did not say hero. We said, I'm glad you made it, and we meant everything the other words try and fail to contain. Once, a county official asked if I'd let them put my name on a plaque at the old crossing. I said no. He asked twice. I said no again. If a bridge held, it was because steel and stone did their work and because the river allowed it. If a man held, it was because others bled slower while he aimed. The plaque should belong to the place, not to any single hand that happened to be there when the rule failed and logic took over. Years turned. The shop roof needed patching every spring, the gravel lot swallowed its own ruts and then made new ones. I watched boys from the high school learn to set points and to measure dwell with a card and a careful eye, then leave for cities where tires don't sing on dirt. I watched veterans sit on the bench by the door and talk about fishing while their boots remained pointed toward Europe. The shell casing gathered fingerprints and dust. Sometimes I wiped it clean with a shop rag until the letters looked new again. Sometimes I let it dull. Memory should tarnish a little. Shine is not the same as truth. 40 years after the snow, a teacher led a line of children to the old bridge. The mill was a museum then, its stones scrubbed, its gearworks chained motionless. The town had replaced the parapet caps and posted a weight limit sign. On the river's edge stood a small bronze plaque sunk into a dark granite stone. I heard about it from a friend who drove past on his way to deliver seed and stopped because the sunlight hit something that didn't belong to water. The plaque read, "Here, one man delayed an entire division for 3 hours." There was no name, just dates. The teacher told the children about winter and duty and how sometimes the right thing on paper is the wrong thing on the ground. They were polite and cold and ready for hot chocolate. A boy traced the letters with a mitten and asked who the man was. The teacher said, "No one remembers, and everyone should." I approved of that answer. At closing time I sometimes sat with the door half raised and watched the street change color with the sun. Once in a while a customer would point at the polished brass on the shelf and say, "You keep that because it's lucky?" I'd say, "No. Because it was heavy when it was empty." If they laughed, we were done. If they didn't, I meant no more explanation. I don't go back to the bridge. You should not knock on a grave to ask if it remembers you. But sometimes, in the shop after dark, when the only sound is the cooling tick of iron and the low seam fire of the stove, I hear snow striking concrete like fine grit, and the distant grind of tracks, and a radio whispering a single word through a bad wire. I do what I did then, I turn it off. And stay. He was supposed to retreat. That was the line written in the after-action report, the one phrase that carried through every copy, every archive, every summary that reduced the day to a paragraph. Private James Lawson received the order to retreat. Paper made it simple, command issued, subordinate disobeyed, result recorded. But the snow had not been paper. The river had not been an arrow on a map. And the word retreat had been nothing more than sound traveling through bad static, dissolving before it reached him. I think about that word sometimes when I oil the hoist chains in the shop. The links whisper over the pulley the same way the radio did, sharp at the start, then lost in their own echo. Orders are like that. They leave one mouth, change shape, reach another, and by the time they land, they're something else entirely. In France the order meant survival for men behind him. For Lawson it meant abandonment for men beside him. So he rewrote it. Not on paper, but in action. He held 3 hours past the clock, through snow and smoke and noise so thick it changed the color of light. Long enough for the wounded to be carried back, long enough for reinforcements to cross and make the bridge more than ruin. Then he sat down in the blood-spattered snow and looked at what refusal costs. History remembers numbers better than reasons. 7 enemy vehicles destroyed, 2 captured intact, 6 American soldiers saved. 1 private disciplined verbally, then quietly commended when the reports reached a colonel who preferred outcomes to etiquette. There was talk of a medal that never found its way through channels. The war ended too quickly, and paper loves clean endings. The bridge was classified as retained asset. The man became non-essential personnel, demobilized January 1946. You can find it if you dig in the records. The ink has bled slightly from humidity, but the name is still legible. I used to wonder what he felt when the first shell hit after silence. Did he think of Kansas? Of metal tightening under frost? Of how every mechanism, engine, rifle, or man, fails when cold robs it of motion? Maybe he didn't think at all. The ones who lived longest learned to move first and understand later. I imagine him braced behind concrete, watching smoke pull sideways in the wind, calculating distance by sound. When he fired, he broke no oath, he simply refused to be smaller than his own understanding. Decades later the bridge still carries weight. Trucks cross it daily, their tires whispering on the patched concrete. Moss grows between shell scars. Locals call it Le Pont sans ordres, the bridge without orders. Tourists stop, take photographs, remark on how peaceful the valley looks now. None notice the faint scorch marks under the parapet, or the way the river runs slower beneath that span than under any other. As if even water remembers hesitation. Some evenings a man from the village sweeps the snow from the small granite plaque. He isn't paid, he does it because his father once spoke of an American who stayed when others left. The son says the story was never clear, too many winters have sifted over it, but that his father heard G** fire for hours and saw the sky turn red from his attic window. That's enough for him. Memory doesn't need detail, it needs repetition. Every brushstroke of his broom is a kind of prayer. In a museum in Lyon there's a display labeled Improvised Valor, Individual Acts of Resistance, 1944–45. Inside, among medals and fragments of uniforms, lies a single brass casing. The tag beneath reads, Unknown Soldier, Remilly Crossing, 1945. Recovered from Bridge Foundation, 1947. Caliber .50, hand-polished. I've stood before that case. The curator says it came from post-war dredging when the engineers reinforced the piers. They found it wedged between stones, still bright, untouched by rust as if the river refused to claim it. She asked if I knew its story. I told her I'd heard a version, a private who broke an order and held long enough for logic to catch up with conscience. She smiled. We never could confirm the name, she said. It's better that way. She's right. Names anchor stories, make them manageable, domestic. But some acts need to drift, part myth, part blueprint. Every generation faces its own bridge, its own fog, its own impossible order spoken by a voice too far away to see the ground. What you do then isn't about courage. It's about geometry, whether the line you hold keeps others from falling. Lawson once wrote in a letter that he wasn't brave, just unwilling to leave something broken. That sentence survived in a box of wartime correspondence catalogued by the Historical Society of Topeka. It's there, in faded pencil on lined paper, a neat signature underneath. When I read it, I hear the measured cadence of someone explaining a repair, how the current won't flow until you clean the contacts, how ice must be scraped before connection is true. He wasn't speaking of engines. He was speaking of the world. He never wanted a monument. Yet one stands, unmarked by name, built of his hours on that bridge, the road itself, open, ordinary, taken for granted by everyone who drives it. Asphalt over concrete, time over memory. Every wheel that passes keeps the story from freezing. That is monument enough. He was supposed to retreat. Instead, he held. He broke the rule. And because he did, the river still divides the land instead of owning it. The last time I saw the bridge was by accident. I had been visiting a supplier in Metz, and the road wounded me there without asking. Winter again, though milder, rain instead of snow, fog sitting low on the river like a man too tired to stand. I parked by the embankment and walked the last 100 yards. The new guardrails were bright steel, the old concrete still showed pockmarks where shrapnel had bitten. You could trace a whole firefight in those holes if you knew how to read distance. The air carried the smell of wet stone and diesel from a truck idling somewhere upstream. Beneath it all was the faint, steady breath of water moving under the arches, the same rhythm I remembered from that night when everything was louder. I leaned against the parapet and tried to picture the shapes that had filled the fog, the panther half visible, the outlines of men running, the hammering of the G*N until it turned from sound to vibration. Memory rearranges itself over the years, polishing some parts, dulling others. What stays is the weight of decision. The exact second when you stop waiting for permission. A boy on a bicycle stopped nearby. He looked about 10, cheeks red from the cold, schoolbook strapped to his back with a belt. He asked in French if I was looking for something. I told him no, just listening. He said his teacher brought the class here every year to read the plaque. The man who stayed, he called it. I asked if he knew the name. He shook his head. They say he didn't want it written. Then he smiled, shrugged, and rode off, tires hissing on the wet road. His reflection flashed once in a puddle, then was gone. That night I stayed in a small inn above the village. The owner, a woman with gray hair pulled tight and hands that looked like they'd never been idle, served me stew and asked what brought me. When I said I had worked bridges once, she nodded as if that explained everything. After supper she brought out an old photograph, soldiers on the same span, the far bank still blackened, the river crusted with ice. On the back someone had written Remilly, January 1945. The ink had bled, but the date remained clear. My father took this, she said. He said there was one man who fought until morning. Her voice held neither pride nor wonder, only fact. She put the photo back in its envelope and added, almost to herself, he must have been very cold. I agreed. Cold was the one detail history always gets right. In the room upstairs I couldn't sleep. The radiator clanked, keeping uneven time with my heartbeat. Outside, the rain shifted to sleet, tapping the window like fingertips. I thought of the 6 men under the mill stairs, of Sergeant Green and his small British tank, of the way the .50 caliber had shaken itself loose from its mount until I had to hold it down with my knee. And I thought of the sound that came after, the first silence, heavier than any explosion. You never forget that pause, when the world decides whether to end or continue. Near dawn I walked back to the river. Mist drifted low, turning the bridge into half of itself. I stepped onto the center span, where the repairs from decades ago met the original concrete. Beneath my hand the surface was smooth from weather and touch. A truck passed, headlights sweeping across me, driver unaware he had crossed the thin seam between history and pavement. When the sound faded, I took the shell casing from my coat pocket, the same one that had sat on the shop shelf for 40 years, and placed it against the parapet. The brass had dulled to a brown gold, letters almost worn away. I set it upright, rim down, like a candle without flame. Then I walked away. I didn't look back. Monuments are for the living, and I had already borrowed more time than I was owed. On the train west, fields blurred past in gray stripes. Every fence post carried a crown of ice. In each distance was the faint geometry of order trying to hold against weather, ditches aligned, power lines sagging under sleet, a world still following rules written by men who believed in straight lines. I slept with my head against the window and dreamed of the workshop, the sound of a wrench striking metal, the hiss of a gas flame, my father's voice saying, "Easy now, let the heat do the work." When I woke, the countryside was bright again, sun low behind clouds. The war felt impossibly far, yet close enough to reach by memory. You never leave the place where you decided who you were, it travels with you, quiet as a heartbeat. Every time a machine refuses to start and I trace the fault, I'm back there, fog, river, frost, the single rule I chose to break. People sometimes ask what makes a hero. I tell them nothing does. A hero is only someone who runs out of options and refuses to lie down. The rest is paperwork. They smile politely, not knowing I mean it. In the evenings, when the shop closes and the lamps hum, I still hear the bridge. Not the explosions, those have faded, but the steady rhythm of water beneath stone. It sounds like breath, slow and patient. The kind of breath that keeps a man from freezing while he waits for dawn. That's all the story ever was. Not victory. Not defiance. Just one man, one decision, and a line that held because it had to. He was supposed to retreat. Instead, he held. And because he held, others crossed. The bridge remains. The river moves on. And somewhere under the noise of time, the order still whispers. Retreat. And the answer still comes back, quiet and certain. Negative. Holding position. Sometimes I dream of the bridge, but not as it was, no fire, no shouting. Just stone under frost and the river whispering below. In the dream, there are no uniforms, only silhouettes moving through mist, men without names or ranks. The sound of the launcher never comes, only whine through broken railings, and the echo of a choice already made. I wake before dawn and listen to the radiator breathe. The world outside is quiet again, orderly, pretending. I think of how rules are written in warmth, but decisions are made in cold. Every life since has been borrowed from that hour, paid in silence. When people ask if I would do it again, I say nothing. Because there was never a choice. There was only the bridge, the river, and the voice in the radio saying, "Retreat," and my hand, steady on the switch.